Welcome to this brief how-to video on creating a performance versus target chart. In this video, we're going to take a look at how to create a vertical target versus actual chart where you are able to depict multiple targets and compare the actual performance against those benchmarks. And the highlight of this chart, or the unique feature of this chart, is that even if the actual performance exceeds a target, you are still able to see the target values, and the actual performance does not obscure the target if it exceeds. So this is a very powerful kind of target versus actual chart. Often called a bullet chart, sometimes called a multiple indicator chart. So whatever you want to call it, it's a powerful chart, and it is finding increasing application in reports and in dashboards. So we're going to walk through the steps of how to arrange your data to create a chart like this. And the focus of our how-to video is to keep things simple. So we're taking a look at the simplest way of doing this in Excel. To begin with this, you need to have the following data points. Presuming that you're going to display 2 targets and 1 actual sales, you begin with 3 data points. Here I have an annual target, I have a year-to-date target, and I have a year-to-date sales. If you like, you can include more data points or more data series for the target values and the actual values as you like. So we begin with these 3 in this example, and we'll start by plotting a clustered column chart. So I'll select the data and go to the insert menu, and on the insert menu click the column chart, and I'll select the 2-dimensional clustered column chart, which is the first option on the menu. Now the first thing we got to do, you'll notice that when you have data points organized like this in the spreadsheet and you create your clustered column chart, Excel by default tries to put all those columns or all those data points as part of the same series. So it's just got one series of data here, and these are 3 different categories within the same series. Now we are going to try and overlap these together so that we can measure one against the other. Data points within the same series cannot be overlapped, so we've got to move these into 3 different series, and that is really very easy to do. All we need to do is to click on the chart tools on the design menu of the chart tools and click the switch row and column button, which is here in Excel version 2016. In some other versions of Excel you'll find it on the left hand side. So when I click that, you'll now see that the 3 data values that I have are now 3 separate series. As you can see, they are 3 different colors. Now that they are in 3 separate series, it's easy for me to overlap these. Now there are many different ways to create the same illustration. This is just one of the many methods, and I'll talk to you about some other methods as well if you'd like to automate certain manual activities that we are about to do. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this category label here, which says 1, and we don't need that, so I'm going to delete that. And I'm going to now try and overlap these 3. And the reason I'm saying I'm going to try and overlap these 3 is because I want to demonstrate what happens when all these 3 are overlapped. To do that, I right click and I say Format Data Series, and in the Format Data Series options I'm going to select 100% series overlap. So here you can see all 3 are overlapped. We have the annual target up here, we have the year-to-date target here, and we have the actual sales here. Now this is fine so long as the year-to-date sales do not exceed the year-to-date target. But if they do, for example, if I change this to 3,600, you'll see that it now obscures the year-to-date target. So the year-to-date target is now no longer visible. So therefore, we got to do something else to make sure that we are able to see the year-to-date target even if the year-to-date sales exceeds that value. So I've just pressed undo to go back to my original numbers. Now the thing is that you can reduce the width of this column by changing the gap width. But if I try to change the gap width now, the gap width of the width of all the columns change, not just the one that I'm trying to. So what I'm going to need to do is to change the width of only the year-to-date sales. So only that one, I'd like to make it thinner than the other two. To be able to do that, I need to plot that one value on the secondary axis. Now that's what I'm going to do right now, is to click that one data series and select the secondary axis to plot that. So there it's gone on the secondary axis, and you can see it's obscuring the other two. That is because Excel tends to automate the scaling on both the axes. So the maximum on the primary axis is 7,000. The maximum on the secondary axis is 3,500. And therefore these three data points are not comparable anymore. To be able to make them comparable, we need to bring both the axes to the same scale. And that's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to right click on the primary axis and say format axis, and I already have the options here, and you'll see that the minimum and the maximum axis scalings are set to auto. To ensure that these don't fluctuate up and down depending on the changes in value, I'm going to anchor them by typing in a 0 here and typing in 7,000 here. So now it is fixed at 0 and 7,000. And it will not change up and down depending on the values. Now I'm going to do the same thing for the secondary value axis, and I'm first going to make sure that I can click on it. So here we are. As I keep my cursor on the secondary axis, it gives me a prompt, and then I click it and it selects the secondary value axis, and now the axis options here show me the options for the secondary axis. I'm going to do the same thing here, and I'm going to type 0 as the minimum for the secondary axis and 7,000, which is exactly the same as I did for the previous one, for the maximum. So both the axes now are showing the exact same scale, and therefore the columns are now comparable. Now because this actual sales is on the secondary axis, I can reduce the gap width or increase the gap width of this without affecting the other columns. So I'm going to do that right away, and you can see as soon as I do that, the central column becomes much thinner than the other two, and therefore it'll still be visible if it exceeds the target value or the year-to-date target. And you can test it out by changing the value of year-to-date sales to 3,600, and you can see that it allows you to see the year-to-date target as well. Now this is essentially the steps that you require to do this. Anything else that you want to do this would be embellishments, and you can do plenty of them. You can remove one of these axes because they're both the same, so you can suppress the display of these by clicking on one you don't want and pressing the delete key, so that's not displayed on the chart anymore. You can change the style of this chart, you can change the colors, the lines, and things like that. You can add a chart title, which we'll add just now. We'll add sales versus YTD and annual targets. There we go. So that's the title at the top. We have one axis which gives the scale, and we have two targets and one actual sales, all in the same chart. Now let's look at adding some embellishments to this chart to make it look a little nicer. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add data labels, and for this one being on the secondary axis, I'm going to add a data label which is vertical, and I'll select it, right click, and I'll say add data label. And you can see the data label is added right there just above it, and I'll click on it. And since I have my options panel already docked here at the side, I don't need to call up that menu anymore. But if you don't have it docked at the side, you can right click on this and say format data labels. And when you format the data labels, you have an option to display the value, the category name, and so on, and also where you'd like it to be displayed. So for this one, I'm going to display it inside the end. So there it is, just inside the end. And I'm also going to change the alignment to rotated alignment. There we go. So I'm changing it to 90 degrees, and so it will stay within that column. If you'd like to change the font color and bold and so on, you could do that as well. And for the other two, I'm going to add the data labels at the side. And I'm going to add this data label. You see the options that are available are center, inside end, and inside base. So what I'm going to do is, because I don't want it to interfere with the central number, I'm going to place it here at the side. And I'm also going to change the color to the same color as that column. So that ensures, there it is, that's the color. So I'm going to change the color to the same color. I'm going to change the font color to that and make it bold. And then I'll add a data label for this series. And move that over to the side as well. Make it bold. And change the font color to the color of that series. Now you will notice that when I move these two to the side, they got little leader lines. And you may or may not want to display those leader lines. And that is available in the format data label options. And uncheck this check mark which says show leader lines, and that will be taken off. So there we go, the leader lines are taken off, and you can decide if you want to do any more formatting to make these more explanatory of what they are. So the reason why I selected the same colors as the column is, one is to identify what they are, and the other is, if you select from the standard palette, if you select a color from the standard palette, that is up here at the top, anytime you change the theme of this Excel file or you apply a different color theme on this, your data labels will change along with the chart. So for example, if I go to the page layout tab and I change the theme to a different theme, you'll see that the data labels follow the color of the columns. Now that we've taken a look at these easy steps in creating this chart, it's time to take a look at an improvement that we can make on this chart to automate the scaling of the primary and secondary axis. We had to set the primary axis and the secondary axis to a fixed upper and lower limit to make sure that both the axes would have exactly the same scale. But we can build in some more data into this chart to ensure that this happens automatically. So what we've got to do is we've got to ensure that we have some data on both the axes that is identical. And that should be the largest point, the largest value on either of the two axes. So take, for example, a situation where the actual sales, the YTD sales, exceeds the annual target. So if that happens, the scale or the upper level of 7,000 is not going to be appropriate, and we'd like the primary vertical axis and the secondary vertical axis to increase the upper limit as appropriate. So in order for us to do that on both sides, on both the primary and the vertical axis, we're going to include two more data points on each of these axes. But because the data points are not going to be visible on the screen, on the chart, we are going to call them dummy data points. So let me add the first one, primary dummy series and secondary dummy series. Both these series will be comprised of a single data point only, and that is going to be equivalent to the maximum of any other point available from the actual data. So we're going to use a formula here, max of cells B10, B11, and B12, and the same formula for the secondary dummy series as well. So therefore, whichever data point is the maximum, the primary and secondary dummy series will both contain the maximum. Now I'm going to add these two to this chart. I'm just going to format this for a moment, and then I'm going to add these two data points to this chart. For that, I'm going to right click on the chart and click on select data. and I'm going to add, the first one is the primary dummy series, and the series value is 6,000. And add one more, and the series name is secondary dummy series, and the series value is also 6,000. And there we go. We see that both those series are added, and I'm going to move the primary dummy series as the first data series. So I'm going to move it right to the back to the top there, and the secondary dummy series as the last part of our last data series in this set of data. Now, to be able to arrange them, I'm first going to make sure that I can see all of them. So I'm going to reduce the overlap. I'm going to right click and go to Format Data Series, and I'm going to change the overlap of all of them. For the primary, that's for the secondary, and I'll do it for the primary as well. So there we go. All axes, we have changed the overlap. Now the secondary dummy series, which is this column, you can see when I click on it, it gets highlighted here. I'm going to plot that on that is already plotted on the secondary axis. And the primary dummy series, which is this one here, is also plotted on the secondary axis when we added the data. So I'm going to move that to the primary axis. So now I have one dummy series on the primary axis and one dummy series on the secondary axis. Now the next thing to do before we proceed is to make these series invisible, and that's what I'm going to do by clicking on the primary one first, going to the Home tab and changing the fill color to no fill. And I'm going to do the same for the secondary series as well. Click that, go to the Home tab and change the color to no fill. So that ensures that they are not visible on the chart, and they are only there to prop up the axis if required. And now I can change the series overlap to 100% again, both for the primary and for the secondary as well. And in doing that, I have to now readjust the gap width. So for the primary, I'm going to change the gap width a little bit so that it becomes a little thicker. Sorry, that was the secondary. So I'm going to change the gap width of the primary axis a little bit so that those columns become a little thicker. And I'm going back to the secondary now and increasing the series overlap to 100. So there's our chart, and that's what it looked like as before. That's what our chart looked like as before, and both the dummy series are not visible anymore. Now we are going to move both the axes. We're going to remove the fixed values from the axis. So here's the primary axis, and I'm going to this axis options, and I'm going to reset the axis to auto. I'll do the same for the secondary axis. It's not visible right now, so I'm going to add it back to the chart by going to the chart elements, axes, and I'm going to put a check mark on secondary vertical axis. And the same thing, the options for the secondary axis is going to be reset to auto. So now that they have been reset to auto, I can now delete the secondary axis from display. So click on the secondary axis and delete it by pressing the delete key. And now I have only one axis visible. But both axes are now set to auto. So therefore, if perhaps the sales would exceed the annual target. So let's make the sales 7,500. If they did, you'll see that the axis does increase by itself, and the sales can be seen to have overshot the annual and the YTD target. You can see that both the data points here are now equal to the maximum value from the preceding set. So I'm going to change the year-to-date sales back to the original value of 3,400. And that brings to a close our video on creating a sales versus multiple target chart. Thank you for watching, and I hope that you found it useful and something that you can use in your work.